me and other so-called Negroes go 10,000 miles away from home here in America to drop bombs and bullets on other innocent brown people who've never bothered us. We believe in obeying the laws of the land. We are taught to obey the laws of the land as long as it don't conflict with our religious beliefs. Whatever the punishment, whatever the persecution is for standing up for my religious beliefs, even if it means facing machine gun fire that day, I will face it before denouncing.
The truth is that I wanted to do a 21st century version of Alex Haley's Roots.
Right.
And I wanted to get 8 prominent African Americans, and I would trace their family tree back to the abyss of slavery, the tomb of slavery, because that's when records for black people disappear, obviously. And then what I call reverse the Middle Passage through DNA and find out what ethnic group they were from in Africa, like Alex Haley claimed that he did. So I got Oprah Winfrey, Chris Tucker, Bishop T.D. Jakes, Quincy Jones. It was an experiment, and it was a big hit. And so PBS asked me to do a sequel, and we called African American Lives too, and we did Morgan Freeman, a man who played God and the President. You had to do him.
Yeah,
Maya Angelou, God bless her soul.
But these are all
Chris
people
Rock.
that are famous and celebrities, and
Yeah.
And the idea is what, that their lives will be more interesting to people.
Yeah, well, that you know, viewers, like real people who tune in, want to look over your shoulder
Which is the
and
reason
get
they read
these
gossip.
family stories.
They want to know about people that are famous.
Right, and this is an archival form of gossip. But here's when the brand changed. I get a letter, Charlie. I started getting all these letters from people. And I get a letter from a Russian Jewish woman who said, "Dear Dr. Gates, I've always admired your career and your stance on multiculturalism and cultural diversity. But after watching 2 seasons of African American Lives, I've decided you're a big fat racist because you only do black people." So, you know, my whole identity is African American studies. That's my day job. I've been a professor of that since I was 26 years old. Yeah, Yale, Cornell, Duke, now 26 years
at Harvard.
Glorious years at Harvard.
This is Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. He is the chairman of the Department of African American Studies at Harvard, the gatekeepers of the world's historical deception.
in my time, we were taught that the Africans were these benighted people, and they were too stupid to build a boat or to be curious about the world and cross the Sahara Desert. It was rubbish. Africans were just as curious as anybody else. The Sahara Desert was a highway. It wasn't a barrier. So I thought, well, and there were great trade routes. So I thought maybe my Nubian descendant had come over and ended up being tricked by some white man and ended up in Maryland or Virginia or something. So that was cool. And if I needed an interpretation, believe me, I could have produced one.
As he panders to his audience for laughs, he makes reference to Dr. Kittles, who is the founder of AfricanAncestry.com.
So it broke on CNN. I was sitting in my living room minding my own business and said, Oprah Winfrey's a Zulu. So I called Rick Kittles. And I said, Rick, did you tell Oprah she was a Zulu? He goes, no, man, she made that up herself. It's a true story. It's a true story. I would lie to make you laugh, but I'm telling you a true story.
Gates goes on to reference the process by which Kittles collects genealogical information, jokingly, as if the process he uses to collect information is completely fraudulent.
So I said, Rick, are you in your lab? He said, yeah. I said, is anybody there? He said, no. I said, when the results come in, make her Zulu, man. You know? I said, you back there making it up anyway. Don't nobody believe you can take some spit and figure out a tribe? What, are you crazy? So anyway, I was a Nubian and it was cool.
Gates is probably one of the most decorated scholars in the world. He holds 49 honorary degrees from different colleges and universities. In addition, Gates is also the host of a show on PBS in which he takes celebrities like Chris Rock, Morgan Freeman, Tina Turner, and Don Cheadle and strains at attempts to connect them to certain tribes in Africa based upon genetic commonalities with African haplogroups, all while deceptively disconnecting them from their true Indigenous American heritage.
Someone made a joke that one of my principal jobs is making people feel better about having owned slaves, right? I mean, I don't think the guilt is heritable.
Individuals such as Don Cheadle, Morgan Freeman, and Jackie Joyner Kersee were always told by their grandparents that they had Indian blood. However, according to Dr. Henry Louis Gates, their grandparents were liars.
A little Choctaw Indian in my background.
She looked like an Indian woman. She looked like, you know, I mean, like straight off the prairie.
They talk about the cheekbones and.
Yeah, you do have high cheekbones.
Yeah.
She always had long black hair, and so, you know, that's Indian hair.
But I've long been suspicious of these stories. How could so few Native Americans sleep with so many African slaves?
Especially in the cases of Don Cheadle, Jackie Joyner Kersee, and Morgan Freeman, who had all been told they were Indian, Gates makes sure to invalidate and refute any claims that they would have to indigenous genealogy. In the most disrespectful way possible, Gates confounds some of the most important lessons taught by their elders and dismisses oral family history as complete nonsense in such a way that these people no longer believe that their elders even know what they were talking about, further driving a wedge between generations.
She had hair down to her knee. I thought she looked, you know, like a Native American. And that's, like I said, that was my mom, and she wore 70s headbands.
Oh, it's your mom?
In the 70s,
Oh,
she
your
looked
mom's
like,
cool.
everyone thought she was Native American.
I have a little Choctaw Indian in my background.
She looked like an Indian woman. She looked like, you know, I mean, like straight off the prairie.
They talk about the cheekbones and.
Yeah, you do have high cheekbones.
Yeah.
She always had long black hair, and so, you know, that's Indian hair.
But I've long been suspicious of these stories. How could so few Native Americans sleep with so many African slaves? Tina grew up believing that two of her grandparents were part Native American.
But you're only 1% Native American. You know how your family has always thought that you had all this Native American heritage?
Yes.
It was white heritage that you had.
All this time, I've been thinking Indian. I was dying to find out what tribe it was.
You're from the tribe of Europe.
Wow.
And I'm 3% Native American, so I got just a little Indian.
You got a little Indian in you. 0% Native American. And 0% Native American.
There you go.
And 0% who were Native American.
I'm gonna have to tell the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma now that I misrepresented myself.
Even concealed within this great deception, there is truth. The confusion comes from a Eurocentric method of classification based upon appearance, more commonly skin tone, which was used as a method of dividing the masses into the social totem pole of the American caste system. The injection of Caucasian DNA into indigenous blood provided a method of genetic segregation. The majority of anyone who is considered a government paper-backed Indian belonging to the 5 civilized tribes does in fact have European ancestry. The only reason these tribes are even in existence after 1866 is because they submitted under the will of Europeans. And by then, tribal membership was used by white men as a ploy to acquire vast amounts of native land. The title freedman was a reclassified label given to Negroes or dark Indians who had either been free brown people of the land or slaves to one of the 5 civilized tribes. Indigenous Indians were excluded from membership. So in a sense, Gates is telling the truth.
Did you read those results?
20% European.
You were 1/5 white.
Wow. Oh, man. I'm horrible in sports, so maybe this explains that. My jump shot is horrible.
19% European.
Are you surprised to know that you have that much European ancestry?
I guess so. As dark complected as I am.
It means you're 1/3 white. Well, that's surprising.
Surprising.
Surprising. You are 33% European. Really? I'm 50-50. To my horror, the chairman of African American Studies at Harvard at the time was a half a white man. Surprising. 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 Surprising.
Look, these are real.
Here is a prime example of how disgustingly low the world will go to hide who you truly are. They hire their porch monkey propaganda puppets at institutions like Harvard and make them Dean of the Department of African American Studies. In 100 years, academia will support the idea that blacks are descended from Europeans and Native Americans no longer exist. But why isn't Native American DNA showing up in test results? Go to Google right now and check out the hundreds upon thousands of complaints from people claiming that they have Native American ancestry. But the results came back and they were sitting there with the Don Cheadle face. All these Native American grandparents, well, according to Ancestry.com and MyHeritage and 23andMe and a slew of other DNA charlatans, your grandparents lied to you and everybody about who they were and about who you are. According to them, your grandparents are liars. And their DNA test proves that. So what's the real reason Native American ancestry doesn't show up on any DNA tests? Just as with anything else, money, power, control. Fact, Native American tribes are discouraged from sharing their DNA with any research company, and nearly all tribes have declined participation in such studies. Imagine millions more people claiming indigenous heritage, and think about the amount of money, land, and resources the federal government would have to commit to those people on their behalf. But at its root, the true reason for this DNA propaganda is to push the false historical narrative of all Black Americans being from Africa for the purposes of countering our will to claim what is rightfully ours.
Well, when I went to Harvard in 1991, I raised money to count the slaves. There were a group of scholars who were trying to count the number of Africans brought to the New World, the entire New World, in the slave trade. And some were in Liverpool, some were in Angola, some were in Cuba, some were in Brazil, all these scholars. And someone came to me and said, if you raise money, that you could bring these people together, it would be historic. And that's what we did. The result, you could go home and look at it. It's free online. It's called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. And these scholars looked at 36,000 voyages of slave ships. It was capitalism. So the records were there. It was property, right? And those records are still there. And guess what? They counted 12.5 million Africans shipped between 1502 and 1867 to the New World. 12.5 million, 15% about died in the Middle Passage. So let's say 11.2 million, we know, Africans, our ancestors, got off the slave ships in the New World. Here's the amazing fact. Of that 11.2 million, only 450,000 came to the United States. Only 450,000 Africans came to the United States between 1619 and, well, the end of slavery was 1865, but most of 99% of the slaves were here by 1820. All the rest, over 10.5 million, went to places essentially south of San Diego, Texas, and Miami.
Although Gates is one of the largest proponents of African ancestry, he himself has written about the relatively small amount of African slaves brought to North America in comparison to slaves placed in other areas. In fact, a direct quote from Gates states that only about 388,000 slaves were shipped directly to North America, which is estimated less than 5% of total Africans shipped through the transatlantic slave trade. These are the accounted numbers of African slavery between the years of 1525 and 1866, a span of approximately 341 years, which means annually, on average, just over 1,000 slaves from Africa actually made it to mainland North America. To further complicate these surprisingly small numbers of Africans in North America is the surprisingly large numbers of Negroes in America, who are presumed to be of African descent. So if, according to the top African scholar and database, only 388,000 Africans total made it to North America, what's to account for the dramatic spike in population among Negro slaves in the South between the years of 1790 and 1860? These numbers suggest that the African slave population had multiplied by 10 times. So the obvious question should be asked: what was the birth and mortality rate of a slave in the late 1700s? Well, as expected, the birth rate was extremely low and the mortality rate extremely high. Most women miscarried their unborn child due to the inherent physical strain that forced manual labor in treacherous seasonal conditions puts on a woman's body. As well, most women preferred to miscarry rather than to birth a child into a life of pain and captivity. In addition to the excessively low birth rate of enslaved captives was the extremely high mortality rate among the enslaved. Male slaves were worked like farm animals for their entire lives until their bodies gave out and were no longer to physically perform manual tasks. Then they were simply taken out back and murdered once they were no use to their masters. For male slaves, this happened around the age of 25, if they were lucky enough to live that long. Because according to records, the life expectancy of a male slave was around 23 years old, and the life expectancy of a female slave was a bit longer, due to the fact that some women worked domestic duties that weren't as physically strenuous as working in the field, therefore allowing them to live longer lives. However, these extremely short life expectancies and high mortality rates are in direct contradiction to the increased slave numbers in the South. At no point during captivity were enslaved peoples ever multiplying in numbers via new birth rates. So how could numbers of slaves increase if they weren't being born on the plantation and not being newly shipped from Africa after 1808? We can clearly see the increase in population, but that population cannot be related to normal population growth or the arrival of new Africans. So where did these 4 million new people come from? Of course, they were already here and being forcibly removed from their homelands by the invading heathens from Europe. From the earliest remnants of the earliest colonies to survive, such as Jamestown, and until the Civil War, indigenous Indians were being conquered, captured, and reclassified into the words and hands of their enemies. And the word American takes on a totally new image than its original personification. What did the Indians look like when the heathens came? According to multiple accounts, the Indians were black and resembled the physical features most commonly associated with Negroes. But when people think of Indians, they don't think of Negroes. Most people think of a Euro-Mongoloid hybrid as a result of the deceptive intentions of academia. But what would the gatekeepers of academia have to gain by hiding the original ethnicity of the people of North America? It's quite simple. By creating an entire historical narrative behind Cauco-Mongolo-centrism, they were able to change the face of world history. And by changing the face of world history, the indigenous people of the land known as America remained under the bondage of profane barbarians and godless spirits born of evil men. When we take a closer look at the transatlantic slave trade database, it appears that the vessels with the most slaves were shipped between different destinations in the Americas rather than from the continent of Africa to America. According to the Intra-American Slave Trade Database, in the year 1700, a ship captained by Charles Duval shipped 308 slaves from an unspecified location in the Americas to Cartagena, Colombia. In 1760, Thomas Lorraine shipped over 300 slaves on the vessel named Viper in 2 trips to Portobello, Panama. In 1786, an unnamed ship transferred 170 slaves from an unspecified location in the Americas to New Orleans. From this examination, it is clear to see that there was a well-ingrained practice of capturing groups of indigenous people from different territories in the Americas and displacing them in foreign enclaves. Some of these foreign ports in which the people were delivered to be sold were in cities such as, most popularly, Charleston, South Carolina, a major slave trading hub in the Old South, formerly known as Charlestown, named after King Charles II of England. Other trafficking hubs include Savannah, Georgia, another southern city whose entire history and economy was built off the slave trade. Also, cities like New Orleans, an area colonized by the French, was populated with Indians who had been shipped from other areas of the Americas. Many of these people were forcibly displaced from areas in Canada and New England known as Acadia, and once becoming slaves under French rule, the offspring of an Indian and Frenchman became known as a Cajun. Throughout this era of human trafficking, original locations from which people were being shipped had been hidden to furthermore geographically alienate them from possibly finding a way to orientate their locations. This was meant to confuse the captives. Many people were taken from the Caribbean islands of Antigua and then transferred to the mainland, as well as people being shipped from island to island, as in the case with General Lincoln, a vessel that in 1799 delivered 50 slaves from Antigua to Havana. The practice of transferring American Indian captives and placing them in unfamiliar lands on the same continent was well documented, but suspiciously overlooked by modern historians. We all know that the discovery of America is a historical misnomer, based totally within the foundation of white supremacy. How could a place become discovered if somebody had already lived there? Under this absurd notion, the world's understanding of history was forever doomed. Eurocentrism is the philosophy that would dominate the fields of power and oppression. The conqueror's narrative became the deadly gospel, ringing from the lips of the oppressed voices, singing ballads of bondage and glory to their oppressor. Aimlessly toiling under the sun in their father's land in search for their own identity, a people without a nation.
And imperialism is I regard it as a disease. I call it the disease of cannibalism. because in imperialism, people think that they have the right to consume not only the resources of other people, but their lives as well. And one of the characteristics of this kind of cannibalism, or I call it a wetiko psychosis, from a Cree Indian word meaning a cannibal disease. The wetiko disease, it's a psychological and cultural disease. One of the characteristics is that it brutalizes people, because as a part of imperialism, well, the thing that keeps empires going is that you have to terrorize the people you're going to control. I mean, you don't get to steal their resources just by asking. You know, you've got to take it by force, and then you have to create a reign of terror in order to maintain that system. So people become brutalized as a part of that. And after you've gone through quite a few of them, then it becomes a part of your culture, and the disease takes you into its clutches, so that the Europeans, particularly by the 1400s and 1500s, the northern Europeans, had learned to become Romans. And they like to even call themselves Romans. The Germans. Meaning building an empire and ruling over others. In other words, if you read a lot of histories in the past, you will find that the French are very proud of the French Empire. All the areas ruled by the French flag. The British are proud of the British Empire. The Italians want an empire. The Germans want their empire. The Russians want an empire. This is the way you make yourself into big shots, right? And people think you're powerful and you're successful. Is because you are messing with other people's lives, right? So the concept of doing evil becomes, instead of being evil, it becomes the ambition of your society to do that.
How very interesting. Well, he's been following me for quite a ways, and I had to leave him in the bush a ways back over there.
You dirty, no-account, mangy little black Indian, I'm gonna knock your head off!
Gentlemen, please! We abhor violence here. Is this the lawman you left in the brush?
What? What lawman?
Yeah, lawman!
Some people may say, so what if the indigenous people of the Americas were black? All mankind comes from Africa. Therefore, the Indians migrated out of Africa. When a person makes this connection between Africa and being the birthplace of mankind, they are presupposing certain truths under the umbrella of Darwinistic evolution. First of all, under this acceptance, a person is claiming that their genetic progeny begins with a humanoid-like species, whether that be Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, or any Homo in between, whose lineage was born in Africa and later migrated out of Africa to interbreed with Neanderthals in Europe and Asia. Understanding the inherent genetic difference between man and mankind, anyone claiming to be from Africa under the premise of this classical scientific narrative is mankind, which is a hybrid between man and a human-like species that can be genetically traced to primates. It must be understood that the most notable factors attributing to the difference between races is geographic isolation and sexual selection. Hidden within the ideology of Darwinism is the fallacious use of chronology, built into this accepted theory of grandeur. Thousands upon millions of years of adaptation and natural selection have propelled the course of evolution from apes to humans. The only issue with this doctrine, as it concerns modern humans, is the fact that this theory involves the interbreeding of man with a man-like species, similar to the idea of a Neanderthal mating with modern humans. Simply put, there is a large portion of the world's population with significant genetical makeup stemming from branches of primates. These are the populations that migrated out of Africa. This world wasn't so new to the nations who had dwelt in the lands since the beginning. The term New World is a false designation manufactured by thieves and their disciples for the purposes of hiding their crimes in a veil of counterfeit credibility. Behind this erroneously fabricated school of immorality are the keys to the true identity of the so-called Black Americans, whose history does not begin with slavery nor end in destruction. Once recognized, the truth about world history will be acknowledged forever. But until then, the fight for our fathers and our creators will continue. If the Americas were undiscovered, what would be the purpose of Pope Nicholas signing Dum Diversas in 1452? It was written that certain families in Spain and Portugal had free reign to murder, conquer, and deliver into slavery any non-Christian. Which non-Christians were they referring to? If the idol formerly known as Jesus Christ had been dead for 1400 years, why hadn't the New Testament been created until 1456? Just a few years after the enactment of Dum Diversas in 1452. The New Testament was created in 1456, which means the New Testament was a preemptive war strategy used by so-called Christians to enslave Indians. How could any Indian have become a Christian naturally if it weren't under the threat of the sword? The New Testament was written in Greek and translated to native tongue through missionaries who acted as friends, all while conspiring to murder their villages and take their land. Missionaries were used as spies to collect, relay, and detail vital information to military captains, as well as tools for dissension among tribes. It was the missionaries who would infiltrate native communities under the false guise of spiritualism, effectively providing the intelligence that facilitated the eventual military takeover of Europeans. This point cannot be avoided. The takeover of the Americas was written into law, which is a political act of governmental operation. In addition to Dum Diversas, the Pope later signed into law Inter Caetera, which geographically specifies takeover areas for the families of Spain and Portugal. But even more so than a political mission, this was a religious crusade and should forever forward be considered so. The Pope is a religious figure. He signed an order to murder, oppress, and enslave an entire continent of people. This is documented history of the intentions of the ruling families of Europe. The idea that the Americas were some unknown innocent discovery is a flat-out lie. This land was and has always been well known and the gem of nations. Let it not be mistaken, the history said to have taken place on the other side of the world, including the Middle East, in reality took place here in the Americas. Quote from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Scientific and scholarly responses to other claims of prehistory, pre-Columbian contact have varied. Some of these claims are examined in reputable, peer-reviewed sources. Many others, especially those based on circumstantial or ambiguous interpretations of archaeological evidence, alleged out-of-place artifacts, supernatural cultural comparisons, comments in historical documents, or narrative accounts have been dismissed as fringe science, pseudo-archaeology, or pseudo-history. End quote. From Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. When the foreigner beheld the shores of America for the first time, no doubt they were overwhelmed with greed and dreams of murder. For Europe wasn't known as the safest or best, or even the cleanest place to live. Many men ventured from Europe to escape persecution. Of those said to be under the stress of persecution were the so-called Jews of Spain. One of these so-called Jews from Spain, by way of Genoa, is a man known as Cristobal Colon, aka Christopher Columbus, for which several places in the Americas are named. Some people may ask the question, how could Columbus be a Jew and push Christianity? According to scholars, Columbus was a converso, which means he publicly practiced Catholicism, but practiced Judaism in secrecy. An even more astute person would ask, if he was supposed to be expelled with all other Jews from Spain, why was he financed by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella? This inconsistency presents gaping holes in their historical narrative and is the key to uncovering indigenous identity. Why was Columbus coming to America? For years, through the phony ideologies propped by public education and social conformity, the public has become a herd of well-tamed, sedated sheep, clamoring for comfort in a bed of lies, happy to sleep in the sheets of deceit. How does one rationalize evil without dismissing good as a reasonable act? Choices made in the gray area are still shades of black and white. Black and white are just colors and are in no way interchangeable as a replacement for race, nation, or culture. The greatness of the nations of pre-Columbian America are forever trapped within the asinine markings of godless barbarians who detest divine wisdom. But the realization of our identity is a self-fulfilling prophecy whose age has risen gracefully upon the present day. And with each faithfully intended pursuit, we redesign the map to our promised land.
%58 of the African American people have a significant amount of white ancestry. You know that those high cheekbones and straight black hair, that came from your white great-great-grandfather. The average African American and the average Native American never saw each other. I don't know about you all, but you can't sleep with, the internet can do a lot, but you can't sleep with somebody you can't see. The average admixture for African Americans is the average black person is 77% black, 17.5% European, and 5% Native American. Now, I was telling the students this morning, I went to see LeBron lose against the Celtics on Tuesday night, I'm very happy to say. Yeah. And I was thinking, if I did the DNA of all the black men on the court, which was everybody on the court when I got this idea, if I did the DNA of all the black men on the court or all the black men in this room, 1 in 3 of you descend from a white man.
Descend from a white man. Descend from a white man.
From the rocky shores of the West Coast to the sandy inlets of the Eastern Seaboard, the territory known as America has brought prosperity and riches to the European in ways unimaginable to the first pale men to step foot on the land. Europe, a small, unimpressive place in comparison, was neither vast nor abundant. But the legend of a land far away with extensive deposits of minerals and resources tempted the heathen into transatlantic escapades, all looking to claim a slice of manifest imperialism. In comparison, the state of Texas is larger than all but 3 nations in Europe. But when you account countries such as Canada and Brazil, both colonized after 1500, the territories in the Americas as a whole are far more valuable in natural resources than the countries they were colonized by. The astronomical size of the Americas represented unbounded potential. Within 100 years, the families of Portugal and Spain had seized an area much greater in value than anything previously held by the families of Aragon and Castile. These families shared the space of an area approximately the size of Texas, but by 1592, Spain virtually controlled the entire western seaboard, and the Portuguese controlled the entire east coast of Brazil. It's imperative to mention the year 1491 as a major turning point in the history of the world, often overlooked. From around the year 711 until 1491, the Iberian Peninsula, otherwise known as the territories of Spain and Portugal, were under the control of the Moors. According to the Dictionary of the Middle Ages, the lineages of Castile can be traced as far back as the year 850, and unofficially quite further. House Aragon arose a few centuries later, as it is written after the death of Sancho III of Navarre. The kingdom was subsequently divided. So the houses of Aragon and Castile had been feuding with Muslims for centuries before the year 1491, when the Moors were finally expelled from Europe. But let's analyze the relationship between Moors and Europeans on a genetic level. The Moors, by many accounts, represented the darker races of northern Africa, while Europeans represented the pale races of Northern Europe. But were these the only genetic differences between the two groups? As reported by the top genetic researchers, the people of the northern horn of Africa above the Sahara and the people of Europe come from the same lineage, and the differences in appearance between these groups are a result of geographic isolation and sexual selection. If the Moors were genetically the same as Negro Indians, how could they survive smallpox, a disease of pandemic proportions spread through the Americas like wildfire, killing damn near every Indian who came in contact with a European? And if the indigenous people of the Americas were of a Mongoloid stock, why were they wiped out when they carry the same immunities to the disease as Caucasians? Most people would be surprised to know that Aboriginal populations of Northern and Eastern Europe, as well as Russia, are all of a Mongoloid phenotype, and that the Caucasian is generally a part of the same family tree that can be traced to interbreeding in the caves of Central Asia. If the Moors were from a completely different family tree, then modern genetic analysis would at least find a trace of another bloodline in the geographic region. But there is none. Speaking of bloodlines and regions, in agreement with current genetic exploration, studies have shown that the Basque region of Spain has the highest population of Rh negative DNA in the entire world. But how did genetics play a role in the conquering of the old New World?
Could you talk about how Europeans went about capturing Native Americans?
Well, it's not a happy thing, but it illustrates one of the kinds of great lessons that we as human beings have to learn. And that lesson is to be very astute and not allow ourselves to be used against our brothers and sisters. Not allow ourselves to be dupes and to be used in brutal ways against other human beings. Okay, often we don't simply have the information, and the Spaniards were often very direct and very brutal. They just went in and captured thousands of people and rounded them up and took them to market. But in other cases, the colonialists were much more clever. For example, the Portuguese conquered Brazil basically by Portuguese men intermarrying with native people, particularly powerful tribes living along the coast, powerful chieftains. And then, of course, Native Americans value their families very much. Kinship is extremely important. And so, without realizing it, now they've got a new member of the family. He doesn't have the same motives that they have, but there are kinship obligations by means of which this Portuguese guy gradually takes advantage of existing enmities that may exist between Indian groups, maybe some old hostilities, and uses then his relatives against other Indian groups. And pretty soon rewards them with guns and with other weapons and goods for capturing other human beings. And so it starts out small, but as time goes by, it becomes tremendously big operations. In southern Brazil, for example, in the 17th century, there was a period of time in which at least 200,000 or 300,000 Indian people from Spanish Jesuit missions in the Paraguay area are raided and carried off to the coast as slaves, largely by bands of people who are mixed Indian and Portuguese or Indian, but led by mixed blood or Portuguese chieftains who are the founders of Sao Paulo, or Paulistas, they're called in southern Brazil. Other colonialists, example in South Carolina, the English are very astute to also take advantage of existing animosities. And they get some of the tribes to provide a lot of the slaves, and by that mean they acquire, for example, lots of Choctaw slaves from Mississippi. Choctaws are among the largest group that are enslaved and are sold through South Carolina to the West Indies and to New England and held in South Carolina. There are also tribes even west of the Mississippi that get raided and are brought in as slaves. Florida is cleaned out. Firstly, all the Indians that remained in Florida after the Spanish period are cleaned out by the English and sold as slaves in South Carolina.
You say cleaned out?
Yeah, virtually depopulated. Florida is virtually depopulated of its native population. The Indian people who later live in Florida are primarily people moving south to get away from the whites. Seminoles, for example. They moved south from what is now Alabama and Georgia. But the native inhabitants, by and large, are enslaved. They're Christians, they have Spanish surnames, but they're brought north here to South Carolina and become part of the slave population.
You mentioned Alabama and Georgia, these names that we now know for these places, and you probably don't know some of the names that were used for, say, what is now the southern United States or the eastern seaboard. I don't know. Would you happen to know some of the Native American names for these areas?
Well, of course, each group had its own name. Up in our area of where some of my people are from, up in the Chesapeake Bay area, we had the term Atan Akamic.
You know, Washington? Or
Powhatan, yeah, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, and all through that area. Atan Akamic was one of the names that was used. Another one was Saint Akamak. It means, I think, our fertile earth. Akamic means a place on the earth. Down in this area, one name I'll mention too is Chicora, which is very important. South Carolina should probably change its name to Chicora, or some people would write it Shakori or Shakora. The reason for that is because the first Africans were brought to Chicora by the Spanish in the 1520s. They accompanied a Spanish expedition which was basically looking for slaves, but also intended to establish a settlement. And it so happened that the Africans rebelled and the Spaniards left. They had some fighting with the native people in the area, and the Africans rebelled and remained behind. This was in the 1520s. So these are the first permanent non-Native American settlers in continental North America, long before St. Augustine and long before Jamestown.
Quote from the U.S. National Library of Medicine and the National Institute of Health. Quote, genetic studies have been consistent with a single common origin of Native American groups from Central and South America. However, some morphological studies have suggested a more complex picture whereby the Northeast Asian affinities of present-day Native Americans contrast with a distinctive morphology seen in some of the earliest American skeletons, which share traits with present-day Australasians, indigenous groups in Australia, Melanesia, and Southeast Asia. Here, we analyze genome-wide data to show that some Amazonian Native Americans descend partly from a Native American founding population that carried ancestry more closely related to indigenous Australians, New Guineans, and Andaman Islanders than to any present-day Eurasians or Native Americans. This signature is not present to the same extent or at all in present-day Northern and Central Americans, or a 12,000-year-old Clovis genome, suggesting a more diverse set of founding populations of the Americas than previously accepted. End quote. do not be fooled. Appearance is not everything. According to the top geneticists, these Australasians and Melanesians are more closely related to Europeans and East Asians than they are to American Negroes. In fact, these are the populations that were said to have migrated from interbreeding in the caves of Central Asia. So although these populations look indistinguishable from American Negroes, according to the top geneticists, these people are the oldest lineages of Caucasians.
The future of the world is just a memory.
But my wife's not Chinese. She's Filipino. That's right. And our kids are Puerto Rican somehow, so there you go.
No matter what you think, believe, or feel, it has been genetically proven. All skin folk ain't kinfolk.
In fact, you know what? My mother is half white. A lot of people don't know that. All right, you were a little too excited, but okay.
Here are the figures. 1% of the African American people have at least 50% European ancestry, the equivalent of one parent. 19.6% of the African American people have at least 25% European ancestry. 58% of us have at least 12.5% European ancestry, the equivalent of one great-grandparent, and only 5% of the African American people have at least 12.5% Native American ancestry, equivalent of one great-grandparent. So for those of you who raise your hand, I've identified the Native American tribe you're from. It is the Blackfoot tribe. That is where you're So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, what we were trying to do is use the new sophisticated tools of genealogy, ancestry tracing, and genetics, not to take our people back to the future, but to take them black to the future. Thank you very much.
The books we read in school often report complete fallacies about history. Sometimes by mistake, but often by design. We have always been taught that among the ways the Indians were subdued into catastrophe was due to the diseases brought by Europeans. Of those diseases, one mentioned most commonly is smallpox. However, according to several modern and ancient forensic geneticists and anthropologists, the real cause was never smallpox. The real disease Europeans brought to the Americas was salmonella, which is a literal horse of a different color. These studies were conducted from the ruins of the Aztec Empire, and specimens taken by several teams of scientists have concluded that salmonella was behind the deaths of over 80% of the indigenous population. Europeans lived in close proximity with animals, sharing the same food and sleeping in the same quarters. Salmonella is a consequence of cross-contamination. Animal to human intracellular pathogens that Europeans were quite immune, yet proved to be fatal to Indians. The outbreak, once contracted by the Indians, was a death sentence and also extremely contagious. The feral epidemic transferred from Europe was zoological in nature. In a realm of spirits, they were the beasts who sought to destroy, kill, and conquer by any depraved scheme necessary. There was no measure of righteousness within their intentions, only wrath, gluttony, pride, greed, and lust were their aims. They thirsted for pleasure and relished the opportunity to enslave the children of Israel. We have all heard the story about how Christopher Columbus thought he was sailing to India, but ran into the West Indies and started calling them Indians because he thought he was an Indian. Well, as we got older and learned more, or so we thought, more about history, we begun to adopt any reason whatsoever to discredit Christopher Columbus from the discovery of America. But somewhere lost in the manufactured rhetoric is a complete lie, which is the implication that Columbus had no idea where he was going or what he was doing is a complete lie. Not only did Columbus know exactly where he was going, he had a specific purpose and mission to enslave the children of Israel and capture Jerusalem. Columbus was on an well-acknowledged religious crusade. First conceived in the year 1452 by Pope Nicholas, the trip to the supposed New World had already been written into law over 40 years before the first records of conquistador Western exploration began to emerge in the historical record. But in the Moorish historical record, trade had been established by Muslims in the Americas as early as the year 932. So if the Moors had known about the Americas at least since 932, and the Moors were run out of Spain in 1491, how is it possible that the kingdoms of Rome and Spain and Portugal had no knowledge of the Americas? The classical historical narrative even states that the Vikings settled in Vinland in the year 1000 and went on to conquer several areas throughout Europe, including Kiev and the Iberian Peninsula. How could the same bloodlines that ruled Europe have no knowledge of a land that had been settled by their ancestors 500 years before? Quite simply, it's all lies. These people are all family. All are in cahoots to keep us in the dark. But why do they want to keep us all in the dark? What does our ignorance have to do with their prosperity? An Indian who is as bad as the white men could not live in our nation. He would be put to death and be eaten up by the wolves. The white men are bad schoolmasters. They carry false looks and deal in false actions. They smile in the face of the poor Indian to cheat him. They shake them by the hand to gain their confidence, to make them drunk, to deceive them, and ruin our wives. We told them to let us alone, but they followed on and beset our paths. And they coiled themselves among us like the snake. They poisoned us by their touch. We are not safe. We lived in danger. We were becoming like them. Hypocrites and liars, adulterers, lazy drones, all talkers, and no workers. As for baptizing Indians and Negroes, several of the white people disapprove of it because they say it often makes them proud and not so good servants. But these and such objections are easily refuted, for Christianity encourages and orders them to become more humble and better servants, and not worse than they were when they were heathens. Quote from historian Jack D. Forbes. In 1719, South Carolina decided who should be an Indian for tax purposes, since American Indian slaves were taxed at a lesser rate than African slaves. The act stated, quote, and for preventing all doubts and scruples that may arise, what ought to be rated on musties, mulattoes, etc., all such slaves are not entirely Indian shall be accounted as Negro. End quote. Forbes found this to be significant. He said that at the time, Musties and mulattoes were considered persons of Native American ancestry, he wrote. My judgment, to be discussed later, is that a Mustie was primarily part African and American Indian, and that a mulatto was usually part European and American Indian. This act also significant because it asserts that part American Indians with or without African ancestry should be counted as Negroes, thus having an implication for all later slave censuses. End quote.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
Old Iron Eyes Cody, aka the Crying Indian. Iron Eyes Cody is known for being the face of an American Indian. With over 30 movies and television shows to his credit, he became the face of an American Indian.
How are you, Iron Eyes? You look great. How have you been?
Oh, I'm doing fine.
Iron Eyes, your father, Silent Films. His name was?
Plume Cody. Thomas Plume Cody.
Thomas Plume Cody. Do you remember the first, he was a technician for, he was a technical
MGM
advisor at MGM Studios?
Yeah, he brought me out here when I was about almost 8 years old to teach a boy in a thing called Squaw Man with Lupe Velez, and she's going to marry an Englishman.
Although surprising as it may sound, Old Iron Eyes wasn't actually a Native American. In fact, it came out later that he was of Italian ancestry.
Many films.
Oh, yes.
John
I made
Wayne.
about 8 with John Wayne.
8?
At Republic Studio, about 8. About 4 of them were...
I wonder how they could have ever figured that out.
And I did a series with Randolph Scott. Yeah.
Working with these great stars, looking back at your career.
Oh, I liked them all. They treated me perfect. I liked them all. I was never shy. I was one of them guys that speak up, you know. I like what I'm saying, you know.
There was no racial, no problems at all.
What?
I was never
Did
nervous.
she just say what I thought she said?
I was never nervous in anything I did. All the 5 movies I made with Disney, like The Ernie Goes to Camp 3 years ago, I did all of that, not nervous, and I got a bad back.
200 films you've done,
I got 285 films.
285.
That's definitely more than 30.
Drinking. Did you guys used to drink together?
I knew him when
Cody managed to keep up this ruse throughout most of his professional career. He denied being Italian until his death. However, after he died, it was revealed that he was not a Native American at all.
Fox picked him up, took him over to Fox, and I'm over there with Fox with him and everything. Then I went Ford with him and everything. John was a guy that was an easy man to get along with. But
If he really liked you, right?
Oh, yes.
But you were going to say something. Go ahead. Like what?
He liked everybody if they like him, and they got to listen to him.
This image of an American Indian has been remanufactured to appear as a European. This deception is by design. Beginning about 1767, some of the ancestors of the Melungeons reached the frontier New River area, where they are listed on tax lists of Montgomery County, Virginia in the 1780s. From there, they migrated south in the Appalachian Range to Wilkes County, North Carolina, where some are just listed as white on the 1790 census. They resided in a part that became Ashe County, where they were designated as Other Free in 1800. Subsequently, it would be later determined by geneticists that the Melungeon people have part Portuguese and African ancestry. Quote, the historian Valmiki notes that in ancient times a race of people had arrived and settled in regions of Tibet. These were given the name Naga Maya. This is historical, not a myth or a legend. This same race later took its civilization to Babylonia, Acadia, Egypt, and Greece. Also, Duarte states that the Mexican solar cosmolith is almost identical to that of Egypt, and that the creation ideogram is almost identical to that of the island of Crete. James Churchward, quote, a notable fact is that we can find Mayan words in all of the languages of the world. In Japan, 20% of the Japanese language has Mayan roots. In India, a great portion of the spoken languages come without a doubt from the Maya. And all of the European languages are permeated with Maya, especially the Greek, the alphabet of which is made up of Mayan words. A Mexican Indian and a person from Japan can understand each other without the use of an interpreter. There are many common roots in both languages. End quote.
Now, there are people out there, especially in U.S. academia, who love to dismiss the tens of thousands of artifacts showing ancient Middle Eastern languages and customs here in North America as fakes. But then how do they explain some of the Middle Eastern languages and customs, particularly Hebrew, that are still preserved among some Native American cultures? Is it just coincidence? Of course not. And I'm going to show you a few examples. Now, I'm not saying that all Native Americans have Hebrew or other Middle Eastern ancestry, but there definitely are some. Now, if you're a Native American watching this video, it may or may not apply to you, depending on what tribes are in your ancestry. If it does apply to you, I'd love to hear what you have to say. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with the name of God. Here are two columns. One column shows the name of God in Hebrew and various pronunciations of it. The other column shows various pronunciations of the name of God or Creator, as he is more often called, in various Native American cultures. Look at his name. Coincidence? No. Next, I want to show you a list of Algonquin words and phrases from a book printed in 1825 called View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith. Now, like many books in this time period of the United States, it calls the Native Americans savages, which I don't agree with. Just because the Native American tribes had different cultures than the European settlers doesn't mean they were savages. But anyway, be prepared to see that term in old books like this. So here's a list of words and phrases from View of the Hebrews shown in 3 columns. The first column is in English. The second column is from Algonquin tribes originally from the eastern United States before the government took their lands and forced them onto reservations. The third column is Hebrew or Chaldaic, which are both Semitic languages. Obviously, columns 2 and 3 are spelled out with English letters so that the reader can try to pronounce them as they actually sound. Look how similar these words and phrases are that have been preserved in the Algonquin languages. Some are exact, some are near exact, others are very similar. And look at the type of words and phrases. A lot of them are biblical. This is the real deal. Linguistics like this are not coincidences or fakes. View of the Hebrews is a very informative book, and I suggest you read it. It has many more examples of language, customs, and beliefs preserved among Native Americans that tie into Middle Eastern ancestry. Another excellent book is The 10 Tribes of Israel by Timothy R. Jenkins, printed in 1883. There are many other old books like these. I'm going to give an example of an account from the 10 Tribes of Israel. It's on page 16, and I'll just read it for you here. It says, "The following is from Alexander's Messenger, published many years ago in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." And again, this book was published in 1883, so many years ago from 1883. Anyway, it goes on to say, "A government officer stationed at Lake Superior at an early day, before any white settlers had invaded that part of the country, after becoming acquainted with a number of Indian tribes, found one tribe in possession of a copper tube, tightly soldered. And when asked what it contained, they said they were not able to tell, but they had received it from their ancestors a long time ago. The officer finally prevailed upon them to let him open the article, and when he did so, he found it filled with parchment, with inscriptions that he could not read, but by sending the parchment to Washington City, where it was examined by competent Hebrew scholars, it was declared to be part of the 5 books of Moses." So that's the first 5 books of the Bible. Here we have another link in the chain proving that Hebrews were here many years before the white man came to this continent, and that the present North American Indians are their descendants. And again, like I said earlier in this video, I'm not saying that every single Native American tribe has Hebrew ancestry in it, but there definitely are some tribes with Hebrew ancestry in them. Anyway, this book, The 10 Tribes of Israel, and also View of the Hebrews, are filled with awesome stories like this. And like I said, there's many other old books like these out there. You just gotta go looking for them and read through them.
Quote from William Penn. "Their language is lofty, yet narrow, but like the Hebrew in signification, full. Like shorthand in writing, one word serveth the place of 3, and the rest are supplied by the understanding of the hearer. Imperfect in their tenses, wanting in their moods, participles, adverbs, conjunctions, interjections. I have made it my business to understand it, that I might not want an interpreter on any occasion. And I must say that I know not a language spoken in Europe that hath words of more sweetness or greatness, in accent and emphasis, than theirs." End quote. Quote from The Word, Volume 17, by Harold Waldwin Percival. Quote, "As we find that the Greek language was composed of many Maya words and roots, so in the Greek temples we see embodied the religious conception of the Mayas that are likewise symbolized in the architecture of all the civilized nations of antiquity. So it has come to pass that the ancient Maya architecture culminated in that of Greece, which serves as a model for many of our public buildings." End quote. Quote Unless this extraordinary identity in the language, architecture, and many other things that could be enumerated, were it necessary in the present instance, be attributed to mere casual coincidence, which is most improbable, it must be admitted that in very remote ages, the Greeks and the Mayas must have been branches of the same family. End quote.
Boy, it's too soon to rest. He's your man. What now?
Well, I'm trying to figure out where those that took them horses of yours are going to meet up with those that took your daughter. Now, if I was an Indian...
And you ain't far from it.
Here's where I head for.
Rock Bluff? Why?
Well, if I was an Indian, which I ain't, I'd rather be looking down on them that's coming than looking up.
Hey everybody, welcome to the first of my travelogue videos. This is the Johnson Humrick House Museum in Coshocton, Ohio. It's about an hour and a half east of Columbus, Ohio. So what you see here, these are called the Newark Holy Stones, and they were found in 1860 at Newark, Ohio, which is only about an hour east of Columbus. They were found in the burial grounds of an ancient mound builder civilization, which the United States calls the Hopewell civilization, who were here from about the 500s BC to about 400 AD. They were found by a man named David Wyrick and about 7 other witnesses. This first stone you're looking at here, this is nicknamed the Decalogue Stone. It was found in November of 1860 in a large burial mound. And the reason why it's called the Decalogue Stone is because it has the entire 10 Commandments inscribed on it in ancient block Hebrew letters. You'll notice there's a person carved here in the middle. It looks like he's wearing a robe and a turban on his head and holding a tablet. The letters above his head say Moshe, which means Moses. As you can see, the inscription of the 10 Commandments is all over the front, sides, and back of the stone. After the stone was discovered, when word got out about it, many people automatically dismissed it as fake because they didn't think it was possible for an ancient Hebrew artifact to be found in a North American burial mound that was a couple thousand years old. And they weren't aware that block Hebrew was a genuine written form of ancient Hebrew. They thought it was made up. Now, if you notice behind the Decalogue Stone, you have the case and the lid, which the stone was found in. And as I mentioned before, David Wyrick had witnesses with him. They dug up thousands of wagon loads of dirt and stone, and at the very bottom and center of the burial mound, they found a wood coffin. When they opened it up, there was a skeleton inside that soon crumbled to dust, as ancient skeletons often do when they're exposed to air. There was a stone found with the skeleton, and when they picked it up, they could hear rattling inside of it when they shook it. And it turns out the stone was a stone case cemented together with something inside of it. They couldn't get the case open, so they cracked it open with a shovel, and that's when they found the Decalogue Stone inside of it.
This is the Decalogue Stone with the 10 Commandments written on it on all sides of it. And this is a stone box that the Decalogue was found in.
Okay.
So when it was found, it was enclosed in this box and you couldn't even see the stone inside. The box is carved out inside exactly to fit the Decalogue Stone.
Well, who's that guy?
Well, this figure here on the front that's wearing a robe and a turban and holding either tablets or a breastplate. And over his head, in these Hebrew letters, it says Moshe or Moses.
Oh.
So must be Moses.
Okay, that's Moses. All right.
Who delivered the Ten Commandments.
Ten Commandments. Okay, well. It seems to pass the scrutiny of the skeptics as far as the Hebrew text in the language. So now I'd like to try to add some evidence to this whole discussion. This thing is polished after it was carved. It's scratched like I would expect. Well, it fits snug.
So the box in itself took an awful lot of work. I mean, if it was really a forgery, you wouldn't go to all that much trouble to make a box for it. So I think that speaks to its authenticity, that someone really this was very important to someone.
This is a lot of work, and it's polished. It's got the detailing of the grooves. It wasn't made, as far as I can tell, from modern machinery. Geologically, I don't see any problems here that would make these things obvious hoaxes. So the skeptics have rejected this.
Well, that's been a factor, but Hebrew is an odd thing to find here.
The fact that it's odd doesn't mean that it's not genuine. What it boils down to is really, the problem with these artifacts is that the academics don't like them because they don't fit the paradigm. And unfortunately for them, you can't dismiss things simply because you don't like them.
Right.
And so the evidence to me seems clear. There's no reason not to accept these as genuine, legitimate artifacts.
A well-accepted fact among Europeans during the first era of colonialization was that the Indians who lived in the Americas were Hebrew. This wasn't just apparent to the priests and missionaries that traveled with conquistadors. It was obvious through their rites and customs and languages. It was often observed that the Indians spoke language that resembled Hebrew. This was subsequently proven by pre-Columbian linguists who say many of the native languages of the American continent were indeed rooted in Hebrew. Quote, "Their singing and dancing in 3 circles around their sacred fire appears to have been reference to a like religious custom of the Hebrews." End quote. The name that the people of the land used to personify the great primordial spirit was the title Yohewah, which was more completely rooted in Hebrew than the title Jah or Jehovah, since the letter J didn't exist in the original Hebrew and phonetically sounds completely different than the phonetical pronunciation of Y. Going even deeper, the people of Israel were passionately dedicated to ordinances of their fathers in recognition of a covenant they had with this great and mighty spirit. In this understood description alone, the probability of a distinct connection between the Indians and the lost tribes of Israel is all but concluded. Even the tabulation of chronology was consistent with ancient Israel, yet completely in contrast to how any other nations reckoned their calendar. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, the growing knowledge of the indigenous Indians, being the tribes of Israel, started to become a notorious rumor among many academics by the year 1832. These people, often dismissed as savages by Christians, were uncaringly exterminated as a matter of sport. And this information spread across the upper levels of society. Measures had to be taken to ensure the public would remain unaware that the Indians were indeed the lost tribes of Israel. Along with this new information grew the reluctance by some Christians to continue killing Indians and pushing them off their land. And many whom had supported the position that the Indians were savages changed their stance. But this secret information never caught wind in mainstream ideologies. And over time, the face of what would be known as an Indian or an American, from the 1832 definition, changed to what we think an American is today. There is nothing new under the sun, and this parallel history is tattooed across the facade of the American landscape. Works and histories attributed to ancient Babylon, ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt were indeed refabrications of cultures that thrived in America first. The connections between ancient Egypt and the Mayan civilization are undeniable. The histories between Egypt and Greece have long been intertwined, and the roots of those empires are steeped in the lost history of the Mayan civilization. How could the roots of ancient languages such as Greek and Hebrew have more targeted origins and use and definition in the Americas than their modernized uses in Europe? At what point did Europeans realize the Americans fathered their entire history and that their illustrious narrative was a concocted forgery designed to promote white supremacy? The smartest of them quite possibly had already known the secret of the ages and likely cooperated alongside the machine of deceit to further suppress the truth. This suppression of the truth would be enacted on a massive scale, and great lengths were exhibited in order to conceal the historical significance of the land given the purposely mislabeled designation, the New World. The elimination of pre-Columbian American achievements were of the utmost importance to the invading heathens. Let's destroy everything they created, enslave them, displace them from their homelands, and teach them to worship our God, and whip away their native tongue. And all while we do these things, we will steal their land, knowledge, and achievements and claim them for our own. Let nothing be left to remind them of their fathers. If this thing be accomplished, may we rule the earth forever.
You know, this is just not a rap, as they might call it. I'm trying to really come from my soul with this, because I want you to really believe and really feel what I'm trying to say. You see, because this is that moment in my life that I'm giving my very soul to you.
Our story will not be written by anyone but us. His story has confounded nations into servitude. Their story began when ours ended. That story will end when ours continues again. Until then, we diligently prepare for truth to reside in our hands, that we may understand the cause behind our calamity. The transgression behind the cause falls at our feet. A debt was to be paid at the cost of our freedom. Our freedom never dwelt within the hands of the heathen. But in their words we became corrupted, and in their laws we grew wicked, and in their ways we strayed. So far away, wisdom vanished into the wilderness of wickedness. Stones and idols, swine and serpents, scribes and pens, schemes of treachery, consciousness of beasts. Blood of another kind, seeds of repudiation. We were warned of this, and we took no heed to our scholars or our teachers. The land was defiled long before they came. What role did we play in our own demise? Once we recognize the consequences of our past iniquities, the reality of our situation becomes more clear. In a land once ruled by our fathers, we have become servants to a nation of foreigners. Those foreigners have disguised themselves as every nation on the face of the earth, including our own. They would like us to believe that we are all the same, but they know this isn't true. So why do you subscribe to their madness? Their intentions are neither wise nor righteous. Their words are deceptive and their compass immoral. Their fear is our only salvation. The truth.
yelling, Harry, Harry.